Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Good to see you all again. Thank you for coming to the Gettysburg National Military Park. Thank you for supporting the winter lectures. I will use an economy of language here. I want to welcome and thank Eric Campbell for being our speaker today. Eric is a known quantity at Gettysburg National Military Park. The equivalent of the prodigal son returning home. Quick story. I've probably told you all this a million times. I grew up in Boston. We used to come down to Gettysburg whenever I could beg my parents to do it. And one time we came down late July, it's after battle anniversary, and we don't get the Pennsylvania cable network at home. So I'm in my hotel room, it was the Hampton Inn, and turning the TV on, and they were replaying all the battle walks, and it was Eric. And I was just enthralled. It was a fantastic thing for me to discover. And then fast forward a few years later, and I was an intern here, and Eric was one of the Rangers, and it was akin to going to Mount Olympus and seeing Zeus. We're thrilled to have him back today. You know his work not only at Gettysburg, but at Cedar Creek and Bow Grove down in the Shenandoah Valley. He has done an extraordinary amount of work taking that site and transforming it into what it is today. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Eric Campbell.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. That was quite an introduction, Chris. I appreciate that. Prodigal son. Wow, that's a great... I think it's apt, as a matter of fact. Thank you very much. It's great to be back. We've got a lot of good years here, and it is nice to be missed. A lot of good memories. So what I'd like to do today is talk about, Chris asked me to speak here, and he said the theme of this year's winter lecture series was controversies and myths, and began to think about how the story of the Shenandoah Valley could fit into that. And obviously, there's quite a few controversies related to the 1864 Shenandoah Valley Campaign. And what I decided to do was talk about the greatest controversy that dealt with that Valley Campaign, which we'll talk about in a minute. But first, since it is Super Bowl weekend and you're going to get a lot of commercials tomorrow if you watch the Super Bowl, and I have a captive audience, you're going to get a commercial about Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park. So I want an honest answer. Who's been to Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park? Oh, a lot more hands than I expected. Who's been to Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park in the last 5 years? Oh, really? Okay. Who's been in there? Who's been to that park in the last 3 years? Okay. All right. Because we've been trying to do a lot of work down there, as Chris mentioned, and it's been a lot harder than I ever thought it would. The wheels of bureaucracy grind very slowly in the federal government. And I had a lot of great ideas when I took that job almost 8 years ago, thinking I would do incredible things and turn what was, a great site, not just an historic Civil War battlefield, but also an historic site. We are tasked with talking about more than just the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley at our park. We talk about everything from the valley's creation through the Civil War and beyond. And I thought I would create an incredible thing, or at least try to. And it's been a struggle in many ways. So what I want to do just quickly is talk about some of the things we've accomplished in the last 7 years since I've been there. Well, first of all, what is it? It is more than a Civil War park. Quickly, administratively, it's in the park boundary. It's 3,700 acres. It is contained in the Shenandoah Valley. The park itself is adjacent in between the towns of Strasburg and Middletown, but it's actually contained within 3 counties. Mostly it's contained within the county of Frederick, but also parts of the park are in Warren and Shenandoah County as well. It was actually created in 2002, so it's been a park this December of this year, 2017, it'll be 15 years old. And at the time, it was the nation's 387th park. Quite amazing when you consider now we have 414 national parks in our system, so you do the math. We are averaging the creation of over 2 parks every year in the years since, in the 15 years since. But anyway, quite amazing. So we've been a park for 15 years. When I got there, however, 7 years ago, not quite 8 years ago, there was only one other National Park Service employee there, and that was the superintendent. I doubled the park staff. We were a park in planning only. There were partner sites there, and that's the other thing. We are a partnership park. So not only are we still a park in development, we're still developing. We have a long way to go, before we become something like akin to what Gettysburg is. But we're a partnership park. We work with 5 legislative key partners. Park partners were already in place when I arrived, before the park even arrived, that we're already trying to do the things the Park Service is doing now. Preserving land, telling the story of the rich cultural history of the Shenandoah Valley and of the Civil War. Now, the park staff consists of 5 permanent employees and a seasonal staff of 4. Of the 3,700 acres within the park boundary, only 1,500, so less than half, has actually been preserved. 1,500 acres have been preserved, and if you see the very last line there, less than 100 of that is preserved by the National Park Service. So the Park Service still only owns less than 100 acres, about 95 acres total. Even still, I think we've done quite a bit in the last 5 years. Some of the milestones that we've done since I got there is we did start park programs, interpretation. You see here a lot of the things that we're trying to do. The photograph in the lower left here gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. The Sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, started in 2010, and then of course 2011 with the battle anniversaries. And Shenandoah Valley saw a lot of action throughout the whole Civil War. So one thing you must understand is, even though we're headquartered and our park is at Cedar Creek, which was an 1864 battle, we are, according to our enabling legislation, tasked with being a focal point of the entire historic district. One of our partners is the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, which oversees a national heritage area, the National Historic District of the whole valley, 8 counties in the Shenandoah Valley. And they're tasked with preserving and interpreting all the Civil War sites in the valley, and so are we. We're tasked with interpreting all Civil War battles in the Shenandoah Valley, and that's exactly what we did during the entire Sesquicentennial cycle. We did battle anniversary programs on almost every single Civil War battlefield in the Shenandoah Valley during the Sesquicentennial, including Port Republic, which you see there in that photograph. So we do tours across the entire Shenandoah Valley. Other things we've done, we did open a visitor contact station. It's like a miniature visitor center. Yes, the photograph you see in the upper left is a strip mall. You got to start somewhere, okay? I'd much rather be in a standalone building, a real visitor center, but like I said, bureaucracy grinds slowly. But once you get inside, as you see here in these other photographs, you don't even know you're inside of a strip mall, a leased space. We have a fiber optic map program, which is like a miniature electric map. You all remember the electric map people love so much? Yeah, well, we got one, so there. And it does a great job explaining in 15 minutes an overview of the Battle of Cedar Creek, providing a very good orientation to that battle. We have a wall of faces and many other exhibits, providing a great orientation for folks who visit us at that orientation center, that contact station. What else have we done? We are doing battlefield rehabilitation. Even though we only have 100 acres, we have torn down non-historic buildings. As you see here, the photographs at the bottom are before and after. Those are non-historic buildings on core battlefield land where the Battle of Cedar Creek took place. Confederate soldiers overran part of the Union battle line during the morning attack at Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864, including land on which Union soldiers, commanded by none other than Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, future President of the United States, commanded troops on this very property that we own. Hayes was almost captured during that attack. He was wounded. He was pinned under his horse, dazed for a moment, almost captured on that very land, near where that house and barn stood. We've just taken those houses and structures down, and on that very land, we also put up a 1.7 mile long 3-trail loop trail called the Morning Attack Trail with an 8-page full-color trail guide. Also one of only 3 monuments that sits on the battlefield placed by veterans. The 8th Vermont Monument you see here in this photograph sits on that very land. That regiment was sacrificed on that very land, losing 3/4 of their number. We restored that monument. That's part of that walking trail. And we now have infrastructure we're placing on the battlefield itself. So we're doing quite a bit of work to try to put in infrastructure that visitors would expect to find in a national park. We're also working on a wayside project and a signage project. We have an auto tour. If you will come down to our park and want to take a self-guided auto tour around the battlefield, you have another brochure with a free CD you can put in your car, and it's 18 miles long. Sound familiar? 10 stops. Follows the battle chronologically. And the problem with it right now is we don't have signs. You got to follow the directions in the brochure. Well, signs are going to go in place later this year. And you can follow those signs. Right now, you got to actually follow the instructions. We haven't lost anybody yet, though. And so those signs will go in place along with waysides for each stop, along with other waysides that will complement those, including this painting you're seeing here. You're probably thinking, what's this painting all about? We got Keith Rocco to do an original piece of artwork as part of our wayside project. It's going to go at a very famous Cemetery Hill. A lot of battlefields have Cemetery Hills, so do we. It's unfortunately still privately owned. It's on part of that land that hasn't been preserved yet. Still a working cemetery, by the way. Unfortunate thing is, the Union Army made a stand there, by the way, a very important stand during the Confederate attack that actually delayed the Confederates for a full hour and a half during their morning assault. Problem is, all this land out here today is not visible from Cemetery Hill because of the trees that have grown up. That sound familiar too? Unlike Gettysburg, however, we can't take those trees down because all that land's still privately owned. So the only way to recreate that view shed, to show visitors what it looked like for the soldiers during the 1864 battle, was to get Keith Rocco, as part of this wayside project, to paint this painting to restore that view shed in the painting. And that painting will be on one of these waysides that will go in place later this year. So all these waysides will go up also as part of this wayside project later this year, which will complement each one of the 10 stops on the auto tour. Also, our partner sites are still operating as well, like Belle Grove, Cedar Creek Battlefield Foundation, Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation, and when working with them, we have a lot to offer to visitors. So please, we have some brochures here you can pick up later if you haven't done so already. Please come down and visit, see some of the work we've done, visit our partner sites, and see this work in progress. It's not that far from here, less than 2 hours. It's well worth the visit. All right, so that's my commercial for Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park. Now on to the subject of the day, which is the greatest controversy that has to do with the 1864 Valley Campaign, and that is none other than the Fatal Halt at Cedar Creek. This was the most critical moment of the final battle of the 1864 Valley Campaign, the Battle of Cedar Creek, which occurred on October 19th, 1864. Well, you can't understand why it's so critical and why it's so controversial until you put it in the context of the battle itself. So that's what I want to quickly do. What set up this controversy? What set up the battle itself? And why is what happened at Cedar Creek so important? So let's backtrack a little bit and quickly talk about the Shenandoah Valley. Shenandoah Valley is not a major theater of operations during the entire Civil War, but it did see a lot of action. This map clearly shows you why. One reason, of course, is the valley itself is strategically situated just west and northwest of none other than Washington, D.C. So it's going to be, an avenue of invasion, especially for the Confederate Army during all 4 years of the Civil War, especially for Confederate soldiers marching north or down the valley. The Shenandoah River runs from north to south, essentially, draining the Shenandoah Valley. And so you're going downhill if you're marching north or northeast through the valley. And the Confederates would use this quite a bit to try to threaten Washington, D.C. If you march down the valley or northward to the Potomac River, you're literally a hop, skip, and a jump to the back door of Washington, D.C. And the Confederates would use that quite a bit to threaten Washington. The most famous campaign they used the valley to threaten Washington, D.C. was 1862. Thomas Stonewall Jackson used a much smaller Confederate army to tie up tens of thousands of Union soldiers during a 6-week time period during the spring and early summer of 1862, who otherwise those Union troops would have been used to threaten Richmond during McClellan's 1862 Peninsula Campaign. Marching up and down the valley and keeping the Lincoln administration constantly concerned about the back door to Washington. The more famous time the valley was used, obviously, during the war as an avenue of invasion is when Lee used it during the Gettysburg campaign, using the valley as his avenue of invasion to take his army down the valley and into Pennsylvania, which led to the Battle of Gettysburg itself. And as we'll see in a minute, the Confederates also used it during 1864 as well. The other reason the valley is important throughout the war is, of course, the wheat crops that are grown here. It's one of the richest grain or wheat producing areas, not just in Virginia, but of the entire South before the Civil War. And thus it becomes the breadbasket of the Confederacy during the war itself. not just defeat Confederate armies in the valley, but outside the valley as well, especially Lee's army. If you're going to keep Lee's army in the field protecting Richmond, you've got to continue to hold the valley itself. If the valley is lost, Jackson said, Virginia is lost. So the Confederates must hold the valley. Using the mountain passes, too, in the valley, you can put an army in the valley itself and constantly use the mountain passes to cause concern by popping out of those passes to the Lincoln administration, rapidly moving your army up and down the valley, never knowing where they really are. The last photograph you see here at the bottom is the Valley Pike, which is modern-day Route 11. It's a macadamized, hard-surfaced road, all-weather road, allowing your army to move rapidly up and down that valley floor. It runs the length of the valley very rapidly. You put an army on that Valley Pike, hundreds, if not thousands of men, horses, wagons, artillery, and you can march up up and down that valley very quickly, much faster than you would on normal roads, and thus really increase its value as an avenue of invasion. And the valley proved perfect for that, for Confederate armies, especially during the war. In 64, preceding the fall campaign, you've got General Early using, once again, the valley as an avenue of invasion. He'd been, as you see at the bottom of the map, detached from Lee's army in a desperate maneuver to, one, not only save the valley, it had fallen under Union control that summer. You see there David Hunter had taken over the valley. The valley had fallen to Union forces. So he's not only saving the valley, but as you see at the top of the map, Early is using the valley as an avenue of invasion to once again cause consternation to the Lincoln administration. He literally invaded Maryland by using the valley as an avenue of invasion, invading Maryland, fighting the Battle of Monocacy outside of Frederick on July 9th, and literally, with the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, plus reinforcements he received in the valley, no more than 15,000 men, conducted a brilliant campaign leading to the very outskirts of Washington, D.C. Why is this so important? Because it's in the summer of 1864. There's an election that fall, and Lincoln's trying to convince the Northern populace he's winning the war. A war that when it began in 1861 wasn't supposed to last more than 90 days. Now it's all going on its 4th summer. And the casualties, of course, with Grant's endlessly brutal campaign, the Overland Campaign, nowhere near in sight, the end is nowhere in sight, and the casualties mounting is just becoming an endless bloodbath. And now, if that's not bad enough, you've got Confederates on the very doorstep of Washington. No, Early didn't take Washington, D.C., but he's sure, as Early himself said to one of his subordinates, we sure scared Abe Lincoln like hell. So again, the valley proves very useful to Confederate forces in 1864. Eventually, of course, Early, as you see there on the map, will fall back, retreating back into the northern or lower end of the valley in August of 1864, but it continues to be a real pain in the side of the Northern War effort throughout August and into early September, launching raids across the Potomac River, threatening the B&O Railroad, threatening the C&O Canal, at one point sending his cavalry all the way up to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, you see there at the top of the map, and on July 30th, burning it to the ground. Once again, making it very difficult for Lincoln to convince the Northern public they're winning the war, and here Northern cities are being burned to ashes. Let's quickly talk about the opposing armies that will fight the 1864 campaign. You've got Jubal Early and his army, called the Army of the Valley. And again, it's not just the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, some of the best soldiers that Lee had ever commanded. This is Stonewall Jackson's old corps before Anderson himself had taken over. Veteran soldiers, many of those men themselves natives of the valley. The same men who fought that brilliant campaign in 1862 in the Shenandoah Valley itself, who will soon face off against General Sheridan's forces I'll talk about in a second. Who's Early? Let's talk about him just quickly. Early himself had graduated from West Point in 1863, but didn't stay in the Army very long. Before the Civil War, he was a lawyer and politician. When the war threatened on the horizon, he at first, a native Virginia, had actually opposed secession. He thought the Union was much more important. But once secession came, he went with his native Virginia. He began to work his way up very quickly through the command ladder from regimental command to brigade command, and eventually to division command by May of 1863, and that's what he commanded here at Gettysburg, a division. All fighting with the Army of Northern Virginia from 1862 to 1864. He assumed command of the 2nd Army Corps in 1864 May, just following the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Early is notoriously quick-tempered, witty, but very profane. He is one of the few men who can swear in front of General Lee and get away with it. Lee will affectionately call Early my bad old man. He is stooped by arthritis, and thus he looks much, much older than his 47 years. He's only 47 years old, but look at him. I mean, he looks much, much older than that in that photograph. And his temper, he has a great temper. One of the best and most concise descriptions I've seen of Early comes from an unknown witness. This appeared in a newspaper in 1864. More than likely, this came from a letter from one of his soldiers, written to a hometown newspaper. But it describes Early perfectly. This soldier simply wrote, "Early is as brave as he is homely, and he is as homely a man as any man you ever saw." The campaign I just described that Early conducted into Maryland to the very outskirts of Washington, D.C., consisted of bold maneuvering through the valley itself, clearing the valley completely of Northern soldiers, threatening Washington, D.C., had been brilliantly conducted and already added to his great and very solid reputation. So he is considered very worthy of his reputation, one of the few men that could conduct an independent campaign like that. Some people even began to compare him to Jackson, who had conducted that brilliant campaign in the Valley in 1862. I'm not saying they felt he was Jackson's equal, but almost. That's what they considered Early in the summer of 1864, almost Jackson-like. Let's briefly talk about the size of the opposing armies. You got Sheridan there. This is his first independent command, by the way. He's only 33. Not nearly as well known as Early, and this is the first time he's ever commanded an independent force like this. There was a great question in the Union High Command whether he was up to the job. He was not Grant's first choice when he gets command in early August of 1864. But one advantage that Sheridan did have over Early was the size of the opposing armies. At the beginning of the campaign, which I will briefly go through in just a second, Sheridan has all the advantage in numbers over Early. Phil Sheridan's army is called the Army of the Shenandoah. At the beginning of the campaign, the Army of the Shenandoah, the Union Army, had about 35,000 infantry and artillery, about 8,000 cavalry. 2 divisions of the Army of the Potomac's cavalry would follow Sheridan with Sheridan from the Army of the Potomac to the Valley. 8,000 well-equipped, well-mounted, well-officered cavalry, bringing the total force of cavalry up to 8,000, because there was already a division of Union cavalry in the Valley before Sheridan gets there, and that's going to be a huge advantage we'll talk about later on. 43,000 men, approximately, in the Union Army. The Army of the Valley, under Early, was a lot less, about 9,000 infantry and artillery, 4,000 cavalry, about 13,000. So Sheridan has an advantage at the beginning of the campaign, 3-1. Although, remember, numbers like that never bothered the Confederates before. It certainly never bothered Lee. He had won many brilliant victories preceding 1864 with numbers like that. At the end of the campaign, which is the Battle of Cedar Creek that we're going to talk about, the numbers on both sides had come down, and they were about the same. Army of the Shenandoah, Sheridan's army, 24,000 infantry and cavalry, about 24,000 infantry and artillery, 7,500 cavalry, about 31,000. So he's dropped quite a bit, but he still has 31,000 men. The Confederate Army under Early, about 10,500 infantry and artillery, 3,000 cavalry. It's harder to pin down the numbers. The records aren't nearly as good, but we think that Early's army on the eve of the Battle of Cedar Creek, between about 13,000 to 14,000 men. So the advantage was almost the same, but not quite as great, about 2.5 to 1. Sheridan had an advantage of about 2.5 to 1 at Cedar Creek. Let's quickly talk about the campaign. I'll do it very rapidly. All right, so the campaign itself. It starts in September. It took about a month for Sheridan to fully grasp the reins of command. He'll start out in September when he gets news that Early has been reduced in numbers. Part of his force has been sent back to General Lee at Richmond, and it's going to be beginning with the first major battle at Winchester, the Third Battle of Winchester on September 19th. Sheridan will go in with his 3-1 advantage. It's the largest battle fought in the Shenandoah Valley, and also the bloodiest. It's an all-day stand-up fight, a slugfest. You think sheer numbers alone would spell the difference, but actually the Confederates put up a very stiff resistance. And what really finally spelled the difference in the end was Sheridan's cavalry. They came in riding in from the north along the Valley Pike against the Confederate left. It was the largest single mounted cavalry charge of the entire war. Almost 7,000, almost 8,000 mounted troopers come thundering across this open plain, smashing into the Confederate left. The Confederates had never seen anything like it. Early had no cavalry that could match it. The Confederate cavalry was not only greatly outnumbered, but remember, they're trying to mount their own horses. They're not nearly as well equipped. They just couldn't stand up to it. And eventually, as Sheridan wrote to the Union High Command in Washington, we sent them whirling through Winchester. Early's army would be crushed and would retreat southward about 20 miles just beyond Stroudsburg. He would draw up a defensive line just south of Stroudsburg, which you see here on the map. This is the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. It's the narrowest point in the Shenandoah Valley. The valley is anywhere between 4 to 5 miles wide and 30 miles wide, depending on any one section that you're talking about. This is the narrowest point, about 4 miles. Here's the Massanutten Mountain Range, which is actually an independent mountain range that runs right down the middle of the valley, starting just south of Stroudsburg. And between the North Fork of the Shenandoah River here and the Alleghenies, you see just off to the west of this map, is the narrowest point, about 4 miles. And across that gap is a series of hills and ridges called Fisher's Hill. And along Fisher's Hill, Early would stretch his thin defenses to try to stop further movement of Sheridan's army through the valley. 3 days later, on September 22nd, Sheridan struck again, the same result. They outflanked Early's left and crushed it. And at this point, Early's got no choice but to continue with the withdrawal southward all the way through the valley. So within a matter of 3 days, Early has suffered 2 horrible defeats, and now he retreats all the way through the valley beyond Harrisonburg, which you see at the bottom of the map. Beyond that is Stanton. He goes beyond Stanton, and in the southeast of Stanton are the gaps of the Blue Ridge. He pulls up there, trying to salvage what he's left of his army, leaving the whole valley open to northern invasion. Sheridan follows, and now he'll carry out what's called simply the burning. He's ordered by Grant to destroy the valley's resources, the breadbasket of the Confederacy. And most people think, when they think of the total war policy that Lincoln's going to inflict upon the South in 1864, where they begin to target civilian resources. When you think of that, you think of course, Sherman. He captures Atlanta in early September, and then he conducts his march to the sea through Georgia. Well, that happens after the valley. It happens in September, and then later the march to the sea is November and December. This happens in late September or early October. For about 2.5 weeks, starting at that time period, late September, systematically Sheridan's army will conduct a withdrawal northward down the valley from Stanton northward through Harrisonburg and back up towards Strasburg and Middletown, towards Cedar Creek. And they destroy systematically everything they deem valuable to the Confederate Army, whether it's civilian property or not. A 75-mile swath of the Shenandoah Valley is put to the torch. 2,000 barns, hundreds of mills, crops in the field. Livestock is either killed and then slaughtered in the farmyards or driven before the Union Army. Total war comes to the valley. And when it's over, the valley is a barren waste. At that point, most people feel the campaign was over. And so Sheridan will pull his army up and set up a position, a very strong position, along the banks of Cedar Creek between Strasburg and Middletown. It's a very, very strong position along bluffs along Cedar Creek, very high ground, with the Massanutten Mountain that you see in that photograph in the upper left, just to their south. Headquarters are at Belle Grove, you see in the lower photograph, and they either have Cedar Creek, you see here, or the North Fork of the Shenandoah River as a very strong water source at their front. Sheridan believes the campaign is over. The only question now is what's going to happen to his forces in the valley. So to answer that question, on October 15th, he'll leave by train on horseback to go to Washington, D.C. to have a council of war and decide a couple of things. What force will remain in the valley to hold Early at bay, and what forces under his command will go back to General Grant at Petersburg and Richmond, and how will they get there? When will they leave, and how will they get there? He feels when he left, nothing of importance will occur in the valley because Early doesn't really pose a threat. Well, little did he realize he was absolutely dead wrong. Early would pose a threat, and he's going to make one more effort, and that effort comes at Cedar Creek on October 19th. October 19th, the Battle of Cedar Creek is actually 2 battles in one. Early will launch an amazingly successful, very risky, very audacious attack, which leads to a morning attack, a surprise Confederate attack that leads to an unbelievable Confederate victory. They split their army into 3 columns, an all-night march, a very risky attack that takes absolute coordination, but it works out of a pre-dawn assault covered by a dense fog. They catch the Union Army completely by surprise. The Union Army consists of 3 Army Corps. You've got the left end of the Union Army here held by the 8th Corps, otherwise known as the Army of West Virginia. The center is held by the 19th Army Corps, and then the far right's held by the 6th Army Corps. It catches the Union Army by surprise. It routs the Union Army in a domino fashion right up their line, routing all 3 Army Corps out of their camps, pushes them 3 to 4, almost 5 miles right up the battle line. All 3 Army Corps are pushed nearly off the battlefield beyond Middletown. And by 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning, it appears the Confederates have won an incredibly unbelievable victory. And then the second battle occurs in the afternoon. A complete reversal. A stunning reversal. A Union counterattack will follow that literally snatches a victory out of the jaws of defeat, and the Confederates are routed off the battlefield, and Cedar Creek goes down in an amazing Union victory. So let's talk about how this happened, and then we'll see how the Fatal Halt fits into this. And that's where we'll examine the controversy of the Fatal Halt in detail. Where did this amazing Confederate attack come from? Well, it starts on the 17th of October, 2 days after 2 days after Sheridan leaves his army. What happens is, Early orders the guy you see in the upper left, John B. Gordon, the second in command of the Confederate Army, and his chief map maker, his cartographer, Jedediah Hotchkiss, who had previously worked under Stonewall Jackson in the valley, to go up to Signal Knob, the very northern end of the Massanutten Mountain, which overlooked the Confederate Army. You see there in that sketch, that's exactly what they did. By horseback and later by literally crawling on their hands and knees, they went up to this very steep mountainside to the signal station you see in the sketch. And on a perfectly clear day on October 17th, they had this beautiful view of the Union Army. They could see everything. Every road, every entrenchment the Union Army had dug, every cannon, every flag. And they saw a way that they could get to the Union Army from an unexpected direction, which I'll talk about more in a second. He came down off the mountain. Gordon told Early what he had seen. He told him how he thought he could come up with a plan to catch the Union Army completely by surprise, and that's when they came up with this very risky plan. Now, when people talk about audacious attack plans in the Civil War, they normally list the most audacious one of Chancellorsville. They talk about Lee and Jackson at Chancellorsville. And what those two did at Chancellorsville is nothing short of amazing. I will argue that what Gordon and Early did at Cedar Creek is even more amazing, because the odds these two faced at Cedar Creek were much greater than what the Confederate Army at Chancellorsville faced. And the march they conducted to make this attack work was done all at night, completely at night. Here's what they did. They're just off this map. Now, I'm going to apologize for these maps, because one thing I discovered after I left Gettysburg and went down to the valley is that if you wanted to find maps of Gettysburg, it wasn't hard at all. People love Gettysburg. There's tons of maps available. There's new maps that come out all the time. If you want to find maps of the valley, you can just forget it. Maps of the valley are very difficult to find. They're not very detailed, and you might as well just try to create your own. So these maps aren't very good. All right, I'll do the best I can. All right, so just off the edge of this map over here to the left, what you can't see, you got Strasburg here, and the Valley Pike runs right through Strasburg. Just over here off the map is Fisher's Hill. That's where the Confederates are camped just prior to Cedar Creek. So what Gordon discovers is the way to get to the Union Army and attack them by surprise is to split the army into 3 columns and get the bulk of the Confederate Army opposite the Union left down here, which nobody expected. Because the only way the Confederates can launch their attack and hit the Union Army by surprise, it is by surprise. They're so outnumbered. Keep in mind, the odds against them are 2.5 to 1. If they tried a frontal attack against this very strong Union position, it would be suicide. Remember again, the Union Army is on high bluffs. 2 of the 3 Union Army Corps are dug in, and they got the Cedar Creek and the North Fork of the Shenandoah in their front. So the attack must be launched by surprise. And the only way to do that, of course, is to launch an attack at dawn. So any approach march has to be done at night. A frontal attack is suicide. So everybody expected, if the Confederates attacked at all, it would have to be an attack against the right end of the Union Army over here. That's the only way the attack could be a surprise. There's no way the Confederates could attack down here. There's no way the Confederates could make it a march through this area without being seen. So there's no way the attack could be a surprise. Why can't they be seen? Because the ground here wouldn't allow for it. You got Cedar Creek, you got the North Fork of the Shenandoah, here's the Massanutten Mountain Range. Signal Knob, where they made that scout on the 17th, is right here at the bottom of the map. There's no way the Confederates can maneuver their way through this area without being seen, and therefore the attack can't be a surprise. Gordon said, we can do it. What we have to do is split our army into 3 columns, march the largest column, Gordon said, and I'll command it, about half the Confederate army, about 7,000 men, and I'll march them along this very narrow path right here. I'm trying to get my laser to work. So it's just the lower path right here. It's very narrow, and what they have to do is make not one crossing of the Shenandoah River at night. Then they got to march along this narrow path, single file. So narrow, as a matter of fact, the men said it was like a pig path. And they had to march single file at night. Then they had to make a second crossing of the river at night to finally get into position opposite the Union left. Try to march 7,000 men at night along a narrow path and stay on schedule. And then all 3 columns have to get into position on time. Name me another Civil War battle where various columns arrive at their attack point on time and launch their attack in a coordinated fashion. Even Jackson at Chancellorsville, his attack, when it was finally launched, was hours behind schedule, leaving him very little daylight once the attack began. Why do you think he got himself killed later that night when he went out to scout the Union Army? And when he came back into his lines, it was dark and he got shot because his attack was late. This attack not only reached their attack points on time, but when the attack was launched at 4:30 to 5 o'clock, it was on schedule. All 3 columns launched on time. And it worked perfectly. That's why the attack worked. Okay, so that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about is the Fatal Halt. So what helped was the fog. The fog did cover their movements, and that's what led to the morning success. Routing the Union Army completely out of their camps, as I said, and it just rolled up the Union Army like a domino effect, right up the Union line. That larger map on the left clearly shows you that. It works very well because even though they're outnumbered, at the point of the attack throughout the entire morning battle, where they're striking the Union Army, they're always outnumbering the Union defenders and just rolling up the battle line, one attack point after another. Okay, so where the controversy comes is after they rout the 8th Corps down here, which consisted of Thoburn's division, later followed by Hayes. That's where our morning attack trail is. And that's where Hayes almost got captured. Then they took in the 19th Corps. Poor 19th Corps had their entrenchments all dug facing Cedar Creek. Turns out they were faced the wrong way because now the Confederates come in from behind and the entrenchments were useless. So they got basically turned the wrong direction, were forced to retreat. Then you got the 6th Corps. 6th Corps from the Army of the Potomac is now fighting out here in the valley. They put up a stiff fight, the only time they were able to put up any resistance at all. After Belle Grove fell, the Union Army headquarters fell at 7 o'clock. They stood at the cemetery for about an hour and a half, stood their ground, but eventually they're also forced to retreat. So by 10:30, all 3 Army Corps have been shoved out of their camps, and now they're retreating north of Middletown. Here's Middletown. They're going to try to rally themselves here north of Middletown. You can see my laser pointer. Just north of Middletown. They're trying to rally, and the Confederate attack starts to lose momentum. And this is where the Fatal Halt begins. So one of the most vivid accounts of the Fatal Halt comes from the man who's the one that devised this brilliant attack in the first place, and that, of course, would be, there's the stand at the cemetery I just talked about. All right, this would be, of course, John Brown Gordon. Okay, so what's this map here? Look at that map. Wow. All right, so I apologize. What this map is trying to show you here, here's Middletown, and it's got all kinds of movements and everything. But here's what I want you to concentrate on. Here's the northern end of Middletown, right here, if you can follow my laser pointer, and this is the final Confederate line around 10:30. They've just shoved the 6th Corps out of the cemetery, okay, and the 10:30, when the attack is starting to lose momentum, the final Confederate line pulls up right about here, okay, at the northern end of Middletown. And the Union battle line is trying to rally itself about a mile north of Middletown up here. Ignore this line right now for a minute. I'll get back to that in a second. But at about 10:30, the Confederates are losing momentum, but it seems they've won this incredible victory. This is where the Fatal Halt begins. And here's General Gordon, the mastermind behind the Fatal Halt, and he describes when the Fatal Halt begins. Okay. First of all, he describes the rout of the Union soldiers setting up the Fatal Halt. He said the Union soldiers were startled out of their dreams and roused from their slumbers by the rolls of musketry in nearly every direction, and terrified by the whizzing of Minnie balls through their tents and the yelling of exultant foemen in their very midst. They sprang from their beds to find Confederate bayonets at their breasts. Large numbers were captured. Many hundreds were shot down as they attempted to escape. 2 entire corps, the 8th and 19th, constituting more than 2/3 of Sheridan's army, broke and fled, leaving the ground covered with arms, accoutrements, knapsacks, and dead bodies of their comrades. Across the open fields, they swarmed in utter disorganization, heedless of their officers' commands, heedless of all things save getting to the rear. A little after sunrise, we captured nearly all of the Union artillery. We had scattered in the various rout 2/3 of the Union army, while less than 1/3 of the Confederate forces had been under fire, and 1/3 intact and jubilant. Only the 6th Army Corps of Sheridan's entire force had held its ground. It was on the right and rear and had been held in reserve. They stood like a granite breakwater built to beat back the oncoming flood. But also it was doomed unless one marvelous intervention should check the Confederate concentration which was forming against it. He's talking about when the 6th Corps was on Cemetery Hill. So this is before that 6th Corps force had been driven off of Cemetery Hill. He continued, the intervention did come, as will be seen, and it was a truly marvelous intervention because it came from the Confederate commander himself. He's talking about Early. Then Gordon talked about meeting Early for the first time after the attack had begun that morning. When the attack began, Gordon and Early were in separate locations, and now as the attack began to roll up the Union line, they came together for the first time. And Gordon, this is years later, when he wrote his Reminiscences of the Civil War, which was published in 1904, okay, over almost 4 decades later. Gordon's describing meeting Early on the battlefield. So he's recounting this conversation they have. Gordon says, at this moment, Early came up on the field and said, well, Gordon, this is glory enough for one day. This is the 19th. Precisely 1 month ago, we were going in the opposite direction. His allusion, Gordon continued, was to our flight from Winchester on the 19th of September. I replied, it is very well, General, but we have one more blow to strike. Then there will be not one left an organized company of infantry in Sheridan's army. I pointed to the 6th Corps and explained the movement I had ordered, which I felt would encompass the capture of that corps. Certainly its destruction. When I finished, he said, no use in that. They will all go directly. That is the 6th Corps, General, I said. It will not go unless we drive it from the field. Yes, he replied, it will go directly. My heart went into my boots. Visions of the Fatal Halt on the first day at Gettysburg rose before me. And so it came to pass, the fatal halting, the hesitation, the spasmodic firing, and the isolated movements in the face of the slow, sullen, and orderly retreat of the superb Federal Corps lost to us the great opportunity and converted the brilliant victory of the morning into a disastrous defeat in the evening. Then Gordon concluded, impartial history must declare that, under these conditions, if one more heavy blow had been delivered with unhesitating energy, with Jacksonian confidence and vigor, and with the combined power of every heavy gun and every exultant soldier of Early's army, the battle would have ended in one of the most complete and inexpensive victories ever won in the war. Wow, great writing. Must be pointed out, however, that Gordon's account was published, as I said, 4 decades later. Early had been in his grave for 10 years. He died 10 years before. It's also important to note that Gordon's official report of the Battle of Cedar Creek never appeared in the official records. So the first time Gordon actually ever talked about Cedar Creek was in 1884 when he talked to a reporter, a northern newspaper reporter, when he came to a reunion here at Gettysburg. Then he writes his Reminiscences of the Civil War, which are published in 1904. So these accounts are coming long after the war is over. When we think of Gordon in the Civil War, that's the man we think of. A dashing leader in his youth. When Gordon's writing the words I'm reading to you tonight, or to this afternoon, this is the man we're hearing. He's not the same man. I'm not trying to say his words can't be trusted. I just want you to remember that he's writing these words decades later with 20/20 hindsight. And his opponent that he's criticizing is already dead. He can't defend himself. Let's hear Early's words on the Fatal Halt. And let's hear what he has to say about why the attack was halted at Cedar Creek. Oops, there, get back here. Okay, this is what Early has to say. And he wrote these words within a few years after the end of the war. Early said, "It was now apparent it would not do to press my troops further. They had been up all night and were much jaded. In passing over the rough ground to attack the enemy in the early morning, their own ranks had been much disordered and the men scattered. And it required time to reform them. The ranks, moreover, were much thinned by the advance of the men engaged in plundering the enemy camps. The delay which had unavoidably occurred and enabled the enemy to rally a portion of his routed troops, and his immense force of cavalry, which remained intact, was threatening both my flanks and open country, which of itself rendered an advance extremely hazardous. I determined, therefore, to hold what had been gained, and orders were given to carry off the captured and abandoned artillery, small arms, and wagons." So thus, in one very concise statement, Early laid out all the reasons for calling off further offensive action at Cedar Creek. Let's go through those reasons one by one and examine them in more depth. The first reason he gave was the men were very fatigued. They'd been up all night during their march, which I talked about earlier. From Fisher's Hill, the 2 river crossings I talked about, no rest, very little rest. They hadn't slept at all. They had no water. They've been ordered to leave behind anything that might make noise because the attack had to be a surprise. Canteens, bayonets, scabbards, so they did not have canteens. And then when they launched their attack at 4:30 to 5 o'clock, they've been fighting in a 5 to 6 hour battle across 4 to 5 miles of rolling Virginia countryside. So you can imagine the men were exhausted by the time they reached the northern end of Middletown. And 2, as he said, their ranks were much scattered. That gives you an idea of the ground they had covered in fighting that battle from where they first made their attack all the way beyond Middletown, north of Middletown. By the time the final lines had been reached north of Middletown, their lines obviously were disorganized. 4 to 5 miles of running battle. Certainly it would take some time to reorganize, to bring them in together, to reform their lines, on top of the fact, again, that they were tired. Let's talk about the most important reason of all, the third reason he listed, the plundering. He introduced this accusation of the men being undisciplined, plundering the Union camps. And as I just said, it's the most controversial reason really of all for his defeat. Early claimed that hundreds, if not thousands, of his men were not with their units on the front line when the Union counterattack came later that afternoon. And this subject is probably the most controversial of all the reasons. Other Confederate officers, especially Gordon, vehemently denied this ever happened. I'll give you a good example. Gordon, when he wrote his reminiscences of the Civil War, devoted 2 entire chapters of his book to Cedar Creek. One of them was an entire chapter devoted to nothing but countering the claims his men were plundering the Union camps. He provided account after account after account from his officers and other officers in the Confederate Army that his men and other Confederates did not plunder the Union camps. It didn't happen, Gordon said. Absolutely not. Those weren't Confederates plundering the Union camps. They were other men. Wounded men that weren't with the fighting units in the front line. They were civilians back there plundering. But it wasn't the Confederate soldiers. The problem is, if you read all these accounts from the Confederate soldiers themselves, both in primary accounts written by soldiers right after the battle and by post-war accounts written by soldiers, reminiscences, guess what they said? They were plundering. Absolutely. Here's an ironic twist. In one of the soldiers' accounts, he got General Gordon to write the foreword to his book. And Gordon said, "This is an excellent account of a Confederate soldier at war. And then in that account, he said, we plundered. I'll just give you a handful of accounts to give you an idea of what they said. And there are dozens of them. They all admitted it. They all said they were plundering. Here's just a couple. Let me give you one. Here's a really good one. Captain Augustus Dickard, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He wrote a brilliant post-war account of Kershaw's brigade at war, throughout the entire war. By the time you get to Cedar Creek, now it's Kershaw's division. Okay? And Captain Dickard was an excellent writer. He wrote about the plundering at Cedar Creek, readily admitted to it. He said, our ranks soon became almost disordered as those of the enemy. The smoking breakfast just ready for battle stood temptingly inviting, whilst open tents displayed a scene almost enchanting to the eyes of Southern soldiers in a way of costly blankets, overcoats, dress uniforms, hats, caps, boots, and shoes all thrown in wild confusion over the face of the earth. Now and then a sutler's tent displayed all the luxuries and dainties a soldier's heart could wish for. All this fabulous wealth and provisions, clothing looked to the half-fed, half-clothed Confederates like the wealth of the Indies. The soldiers broke over all order and discipline for a moment or two and helped themselves. When he got to the front line, before the Confederate attack, before the Union counterattack came that afternoon, he said, I looked to the rear. What a sight. Here came stragglers who looked like half the army, laden with every imaginable kind of plunder. They loaded themselves up with new tents, nice blankets, overcoats, and pants. I saw one man with a stack of wool hats on his head, one pressed on the other until it reached for more than an arm's length over his head. Clement Evans is a division commander. He's commanding Gordon's old division during the attack, while Gordon commands the 2nd Corps. And he writes to his wife after the battle, the immense amount of plunder on the battlefield caused a great deal of straggling, and proper steps were not taken to prevent it. I have seldom seen a richer battlefield. Yet in Gordon's book after the war, guess what Evans said? My men didn't plunder. Never happened. So he changed his tune. But he writes to his wife, on October 21st, 2 days after the battle, the men were plundering. I'll just read one more account. And this man is really the best account of all of them. It's a post-war account. And he also not only admits that it happened, but he also talked about why it happened. Why the men disobeyed orders and did it anyway. His name is John Worsom. He's in the 21st Virginia. He says, the world will never know the extreme poverty of the Confederate soldier at that time. Hundreds of the men who were in the charge and captured the enemy works were barefoot. Every one of them was ragged. Many had clothing, but many had nothing on but what they wore, and none had eaten a square meal in weeks. In passing through Sheridan's camp, they had a great temptation thrown their way. Many of the tents were open, and in plain sight were shoes, rations, overcoats, and blankets. Some of the men secured well-filled haversacks. The temptation to stop and eat was too great. Others tried on shoes, others put on warm pants in place of tattered ones, others got overcoats and blankets, articles so much needed for the coming cold. In this way, Early's men were straggling, and accounts for the thin line at the front. So again, most of these men admitted they had done it, and most of the accounts say at least a third of the Confederate army was back straggling, plundering when the Confederates faced that Union counterattack in the afternoon. And this is a Confederate army that's already facing 2.5 to 1 odds at Cedar Creek. The last reason that Early mentioned in why he stopped the attack was the immense force of Union cavalry. And that's, again, also very important. Throughout the campaign, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, Sheridan has a great superiority in cavalry over Early. Remember I mentioned there was 2 divisions of cavalry that had been sent up from the Army of the Potomac, 6,000 well-equipped, well-mounted, well-officered troopers that served with him throughout the entire campaign. So 3 divisions total served with Sheridan's army. That's 9,000 troopers total. And as I said, 1 month before at 3rd Winchester, they had mounted the largest mounted cavalry charge of the entire war. It was a sight that these Confederate soldiers simply could not put out of their minds. Seeing that immense force of cavalry thundering across that open plain and into their left flank at 3rd Winchester, which was just, it instilled a great fear and dread into these Confederate infantrymen. What made it worse was the fact that Early had nothing to counter it. His cavalry at the beginning of the campaign, simply could not match it. It could not protect his infantry from that kind of cavalry threat. And what made it worse was, during the campaign itself, Early's cavalry had been all but destroyed. At Tom's Brook on October 9th, in that cavalry battle, Early's cavalry had literally been destroyed. And at Cedar Creek, what little was left of the cavalry force for the Confederate Army had been badly misused by Early. And it literally was not on the battlefield. So when Early got to that final line north of Middletown, his flanks were almost completely open, on exposed open ground. And so to try to advance any further with his flanks unprotected, he knew, as he said in that earlier quote, would be extremely hazardous without any kind of force to protect his flanks. And despite the immense success they had had, here's exactly what I'm talking about. Out here, as you see, is Union cavalry. Whose division is that up there? George Armstrong Custer's. Over here, Merritt's cavalry. To try to advance across this open plain with nothing to protect your flanks would be almost suicidal. And despite the success they had that morning in crushing the Union infantry, nothing had touched the Union cavalry. It was still intact. So we're still talking about 6,000 Union cavalry intact and ready to go. And after the morning attack, what does Early have? The odds are still in the Union's favor. So he knew to try to advance any further would probably be taking a tremendous risk. So it's a very good reason not to advance any further. And he really was 100% correct. He actually did try to advance. At 1 o'clock, he tried to push his men forward. Was it a really good effort? Honestly, no. He only pushed his left wing forward. These men right here would be Kershaw, Ramser's, and Gordon's division. They did push forward across this field here to what's called Miller's Lane. And they immediately ran into resistance. Skirmishers of the 6th Corps and the 19th Corps out here began to put up resistance. The Union Army said it was an attack, which they repulsed, but it really was nothing more than heavy skirmishing. But certainly it was enough to convince Gordon and Kershaw and Ramser that they weren't going to go very far. And so after getting to Miller's Lane and meeting any kind of resistance at all, they stopped. And this brought the Confederates to their final line. Their left wing was pushed forward to Miller's Lane, and that's where they stopped, out here to the Miller House and along this lane, easily defended by heavy and very stout limestone walls. So the left wing was out here, and then the line kind of jogged back to the right wing over here, and by 1:30, 2 o'clock, the final Confederate line was set. And that's where it finally halted until the final Union counterattack came at 4. So that 1 o'clock advance pretty much proved to Early there was no reason to make any more effort because they weren't going to go very far. And so that's when he called off any future offensive operation. And as I said before, as I quoted Early before, I determined therefore to try to hold what had been gained, and orders were given for the carrying off of the captured and abandoned artillery, small arms, and wagons. That was the final line. What were those gains? 1,000 prisoners, which he'd gotten off the battlefield, put them under guard, disarmed them, gotten them off the battlefield. They'd also captured 24 cannon. That's pretty amazing. 24 cannon. His plan was simple. Wait till darkness, which was around 5 o'clock. So only had to wait another 3.5 hours. Wait till darkness, and under cover of darkness withdraw from the battlefield. And as far as Early was concerned, against incredible odds, he would have gotten away and he would have achieved a spectacular, unbelievable victory at Cedar Creek. He would have done exactly what he was supposed to have done. Win an unbelievable victory. What Early never did say in writing, but what I believe you can deduce by reading between the lines was this. What he couldn't fathom happening was the idea of the Army of the Shenandoah, the Union Army, so badly defeated, shattered, and driven from the field by his surprise attack, being able to rally itself before nightfall and being able to fight later that day. He assumed, obviously incorrectly, looking back with hindsight, they could launch a full-scale counterattack by nightfall. He assumed what would happen was it would rally itself at best and retreat back to Winchester, 15 miles to the north. And thus he would be able to withdraw himself, and he would have won this spectacular victory. Early's assumption seems, in my mind, extremely reasonable. No army so badly defeated could rally itself in the remaining hours of daylight. And when you think about any other Civil War battle where an army like Sheridan's at Cedar Creek had been that badly defeated, how could it rally itself? And he wasn't the only one that was thinking this or assuming this. Most of the Union soldiers seemed to be thinking this. So let me read one account from a Union soldier who had been defeated that morning. This is how he felt. He said, this is around 10:30 when they were retreating northward, north of Middletown. He said, the time came when the Army of the Shenandoah, lately triumphant in victory, was in danger of annihilation, was compelled to retire, humiliated by an undeniable defeat. The army was woefully shattered. Gloomily our men tramped across the fields, depressed in spirit, languid in body, hungry and thirsty. They feared all their former victories had been rendered profitless by this one miserable defeat. They reflected that a crushing weight of the news, this battle must fall upon the North, and they trembled for the Union cause. The Union High Command at Cedar Creek felt the same way. Remember, Sheridan wasn't there. He had left to go to Washington, D.C., and when his army had been crushed by the surprise Confederate attack, he was not at Cedar Creek. He had actually returned to the valley the day before, spent the night in Winchester, and expected to ride leisurely back to his army that morning on the 19th. Well, as we know today, what happened was he began to ride back to his army and began to encounter, of course, defeated Union soldiers, only finding out belatedly a battle was underway, and then he began to ride back more earnestly, which begins his famous Sheridan's Ride, rallying his men along the way, only to find out the disaster that had befallen his army. When he returned to the field around 10:30, just about the time the Fatal Halt is beginning, he gets back to his army, rides up to his subordinate commanders, who tried to explain to him what happened. Wouldn't you love to hear their explanation? And then one of his commanders said, "General, our army has rallied itself enough. I think we're in good enough shape to return to Winchester." Even they assumed that's all they could do. Even they assumed the best they could do was retreat off the battlefield, and the battle had been lost. Early assumed the battle was over. The Union soldiers assumed the battle was over. The Union High Command assumed the battle was over. The only person who didn't assume the battle was over was Sheridan. And that's exactly how he reacted. Hell no, we're not going to retreat. And what happened was, of course, single-handedly, he turned the battle around. He rode along the length of his lines, he showed himself to his men, and the sight of him back with his army instantly restored their morale. One minute they're depressed, they're dispirited, the next minute they're ready to go. It took several hours, of course, before their lines were fully pulled back together, before a plan of attack could be put together, but eventually that's what would happen. The counterattack would be launched at 4, and that counterattack would turn the battle from a disaster to a victory. Cedar Creek would go down in history by nightfall as a stupendous, overwhelming Union victory. It turned the entire battle around, it turned the entire campaign around, and Cedar Creek would go down as a Union victory. Just 3 weeks before the presidential election, by the way, which of course had a big result or a huge impact on Lincoln's chances for re-election. But my point here is, I think Early's assumption was quite correct that he had won the Battle of Cedar Creek at noon on October 19, 1864. If it wasn't for Sheridan's return to the battlefield, he probably would have been proven correct, because the only person who didn't believe the battle was over was Sheridan himself. In the aftermath of the defeat, of course, Early didn't do himself any favors. While he never publicly or officially admitted any blame for the Fatal Halt, he did seem to do so privately to others behind the scenes. A good example would be Jedediah Hotchkiss, his map maker. Hotchkiss, as we know, kept a diary, which was later published. The day after the battle, he did talk to Hotchkiss, and Hotchkiss recorded Early's thoughts in the diary. Hotchkiss wrote, "Thus, one of the most brilliant victories of the war was turned into one of the most disgraceful defeats, all owing to the delay in pressing the enemy after we got to Middletown. As Early said, the Yankees got whipped and we got scared." 4 days later, so on October 23rd, Early would send Hotchkiss to Richmond with Hotchkiss's map he drew of the battlefield, along with the initial report that Early had written of the battle. And he wanted Hotchkiss to go to explain to Lee the disaster that had occurred at Cedar Creek. And the last thing that Early told Hotchkiss was this. Early said to me, "Do not tell General Lee we ought to have advanced in the morning at Middletown. For," he said, we ought to have done so. So it seemed to be Early was having second thoughts right after the battle that maybe they should have advanced at Cedar Creek. But even worse, in his official reports to Lee, not only did Early not admit any fault of his own, what he did instead was he blamed his soldiers for the defeat at Cedar Creek, accusing them of, quote, bad conduct. Here's a few passages from his initial reports that Early gave to Lee in the days right after the battle. One report written on October 20th says, "My left gave way and the rest of the troops took up the panic that could not be rallied, retreating in confusion. But for their bad conduct, I would have defeated Sheridan's whole force." In another passage, he said, "My men ran without sufficient cause." Here's another passage. He said, "The left gave way not because there was any pressure on them, but from the insane idea of being outflanked. Then the whole command falling back in such a panic, I had to order the right wing to fall back, and most of them took up the panic also. I found it impossible to rally the troops. They would not listen to entreaties, threats, or appeals of any kind. A terror of the enemy's cavalry had seized them, and there was no holding them. They left the field in the greatest confusion. The panic was so great, nothing could be done. The rout was as thorough and disgraceful as ever happened to our army. The state of things was distressing and mortifying beyond measure. We had within our grasp a glorious victory and lost it by the uncontrollable propensity of our men to plunder in the first place, and the subsequent panic among those who, if they had kept their places, which was without sufficient cause, and they began to retreat." Was Early's charge that his soldiers broke and ran shamefully at Cedar Creek true? Like the charge that they plundered also true? Well, like Gordon did before, he later claimed, no, that's not true. It never happened. The men didn't break without cause. They didn't run without cause. Well, guess what the soldiers said? Yeah, we ran. And they admitted it. Here's another good account. Let's hear from Augustus Dickard again. Dickard, in his post-war account, said, "Someone raised the cry when the Union counterattack came. He was caught up and hurried along the line, all omens of ill luck. The cavalry is surrounding us." In a moment, our whole line was in one wild confusion, like all pandemonium had broken loose. None halted to listen to orders or commands. So, in some sense, Early was right. The men did pick up the cry of cavalry and took off. Of course, what made it all the worse on Early was his own words. He did himself in. He didn't win any favors. Because instead of just reporting this stuff to Lee and keeping it within the high command, he decided to make these accusations public. In an extremely poor decision, Early had a document called an address from Early to his troops released to the newspapers within days after the disaster at Cedar Creek. And he did it before the troops even saw it. And Early did not pull any punches. Let me just read part of this speech. And the first time his troops see this is when they read the papers. "I have the mortification of announcing to you today, by your subsequent misconduct, all the benefits that the victory were lost and a serious disaster occurred. Had you remained steadfast to your duty and your colors, the victory would have been one of the most brilliant and most decisive of the war. You would have gloriously retrieved the reverses at Winchester and Fisher's Hill and entitled yourself to the admiration and gratitude of your country. But many of you, including the commissioned officers, yielding to a disgraceful propensity for plunder, deserted your colors to appropriate to yourselves the abandoned property of the enemy. And subsequently, those who had remained at the post, seeing your ranks thinned by the absence of plunderers, when the enemy late in the afternoon attacked, yielded to a needless panic and fled the field in confusion, thereby converting a splendid victory into a disaster. Had any respectable number of you listened to the appeals made to you and made a stand, the disaster would have been averted, and the substantial fruits of victory assured. But under the insane dread of being flanked and a panic-stricken terror of the enemy's cavalry, you would listen to no appeal, threat, or order, and allowed a small body of cavalry to penetrate your train and carry off a number of pieces of artillery and wagons, which your disorder left unprotected." So you can imagine how the men reacted. All loyalty to Early was gone following this episode. Most of them simply were glad when they left the valley and left his command and were ordered back to Richmond and its defenses in December. Gordon took the 2nd Corps went back to Richmond, leaving Early with very little left in the valley itself. And years later, long after the war was over, and the various participants began to write their versions of events, it's not surprising that most of these Confederate veterans began to side with Gordon. For after all, it was Gordon who was defending the Confederate soldiers' honor, not Early. Early still was defending himself and his reputation. Thus, most histories of the valley, when they were written, of the campaign of 1864, began to lay most of the blame of the fatal halt on Early, taking Gordon's side. It didn't really hurt Gordon that he got the last word, did it? But looking back over 150 years later, with perfect 20/20 hindsight, I think we could see most of the pros and cons of each side. In my mind, it seems that Early has the better arguments. If he made any mistake at all, in my mind, it was that he stayed in his forward position too long. It was not good defensive ground. Looking back with hindsight, certainly what he should have done was pull back. After he won his victory, made his fatal halt, if that's what you want to call it, maybe he should have pulled back to Cedar Creek. Or even further, certainly one of his soldiers thought so, who later wrote in his post-war account, if Early had moved all of our captured goods back to Fisher's Hill, it would have been one of the grandest successes of the war, but he did not, and it proved to be one of the greatest disasters. So maybe he should have pulled back to a better defensive position. But we can only say that with perfect hindsight. In his mind, again, why should he pull back when the Union Army never has a chance of counterattacking? As I said, Gordon, who almost always seems to get the last word, will also have the last word here as well. Whoever was to blame for the fatal halt, or whoever you want to believe, he was right about one thing. By sunset of October 19th, 1864, the Confederate Army of the Valley had suffered a humiliating defeat. And he summed it up very well that day, that day perfectly by simply writing, "Thus ended the day which had witnessed a most brilliant victory converted into one of the most complete and ruinous routs of the entire war." And he also said this, "No battle of the entire war, with the single exception of Gettysburg, has provoked such varied and conflicting comments and such prolonged controversy as this remarkable engagement between Sheridan and Early at Cedar Creek. No battle has been so greatly misunderstood in important particulars, nor have the accounts of the battle been so productive in injustice to certain actors in it, nor so strangely effective in converting misapprehensions into so-called history." Thank you.